Okay, so sometime in 2023, the debt limit is going to come back on the agenda because Congress kicked it forward for a while. Tori, you've got an interesting question for Jon about about the debt limit and a Republican majority.
Yeah, I realize we're sort of straying from the original topic, which was what's Congress going to do this year? We're looking a little bit ahead to next year, peeking around the corner. And it's probably true that the Congress is going to have to deal with the debt limit next year. And my question is, if Republicans succeed, as expected, in taking one or both chambers in the November elections, President Biden, Democrat, will still be President Biden. So what are Republicans going to ask for from the president in exchange for their votes for raising the debt limit?
Yeah, this is a tough issue. I think that you look at what the Senate has been typically quiet about what their plans are should they take the majority. McConnell's view is that they don't need to have really detailed policy plans to roll out during the election. It just opens them to attack. But in the House, they're working together on they have these task groups, and task forces are focusing on things like the economy and healthcare and a bunch of other things. And they want to come out of the gates with a proactive agenda. And I think that, we don't know exactly, these task forces recommendations are a little vague. So we don't know exactly what's going to be the price for the debt ceiling increase, but this is going to be a really, really challenging vote. And I think that it's going to be very hard to get a lot of Republicans to vote in favor of a debt ceiling increase. And I think you're going to end up having a vote that gets done with a lot of Democrats. Mm-hmm. Now, what are the Republicans going to try to leverage here? Well, I think that, if the past tells us anything, it's that, this is seen as an opportunity to get some pretty politically charged things. And I don't think those things are going to be fiscal in nature next year. I think you probably have this dynamic we talked about earlier where Republicans are actually potentially in favor of increasing defense spending, and therefore will be willing to do a deal on domestic discretionary spending. So I don't see fiscal policies being in play. I do think that if you look at what the GOP is campaigning on this year, there's a lot of social stuff. So, a lot of social stuff, a lot of anti-Biden stuff. So I think that you probably see, if I were making demands, if I'm in the room kind of collecting demands from members and what they want on their vote on the debt limit, I think you're going to hear people offering things like, opposing mask mandates, opposing vaccine mandates, some other kind of unfinished business from the pandemic. I think you're going to have stuff about education. If you look at, Republicans think they have a strong message on education, and talking about race issues or transgender issues in schools is probably going to be one of the politically charged things that could get linked up here. I bet they're going to try to fire Anthony Fauci, and they could see the debt limit as a must-pass bill. It's an opportunity to do that. Then you've got actual things that are related to inflation, such as increasing domestic fossil fuel production. The very first vote of the Republican majority in 2015 was on the Keystone XL pipeline, which here we are, 7 years later, and it's still not done, and it is actually still politically relevant because it's related to the cost and availability of fuel. So I think you're going to see a lot of stuff like that. I'd be really surprised if you end up seeing anything on the fiscal side. And I think Democrats are going to give a lot of that a thumbs down. And because Biden's president, you'll have a vote that ends up being overwhelmingly Democratic, plus some Republicans getting this done sometime in February, March of next year.
So the last time we had this experience with a Republican-controlled Congress, spending that was out of control, and a Democratic president, we ended up with something called the Budget Control Act, which capped discretionary spending for 10 years. That was kind of an arduous and painful process for both parties. You don't see any talk of that ever in as far as the debt limit goes, or any kind of budget process reforms of any kind.
It's possible, and I think one of the advantages of the Deficit Control Act was that you had a process that set up kind of the need to renegotiate the caps, the discretionary caps every 2 years, and that over the 10-year lifespan of the Budget Control Act led to a bunch of bipartisan agreements, all of which increased spending, but they did kind of create some structure around the appropriations process that doesn't exist today. So I think you could argue that was probably a virtue. It's certainly possible. I mean, I think that, I think one of the challenges here is what we talked about earlier, which is that I think you're going to have a lot of people who want the government to spend more money. No one actually is that concerned about deficits right now politically. So it's certainly possible. I don't know, I don't think that anyone's really focused on this in Congress right now. are really asking themselves the question, what are we going to need to do to get this done? But I wouldn't rule that out.
Mhm.
Seems to me it could be a real challenge for McCarthy if the House goes back to Republican hands. You mentioned that there'd have to be a lot of Democratic votes. And, you know, in the past, that was a problem for Boehner. It was a problem for Ryan. You know, when you had to make a deal, that you had to get Democratic votes. So given the nature of the House caucus, particularly if they take over the House, a deal that to raise the debt limit with the Biden administration could be problematic for
Getting a majority of the majority to vote yes.
yeah,
you think?
right.
Right. You know, it could be very difficult. And I don't think McCarthy wants to come out of the gate with this, which actually opens the door to there being some kind of deal in December of this year that clears the decks on both appropriated spending, gives you a CR or whatever through October, and does a debt limit extension. I think that actually would be a deal that if I were in Kevin McCarthy's shoes, I would take in a heartbeat. Now, there may be a lot of pressure on him to not take a deal like that. And there may not be 60 votes in the Senate for a deal like that. But I think that would be a really nice way to wrap all these issues up, knowing that, you know, the Q1 of 2023, you don't want to spend distracted by a potential default.